Kia ora no tātou I hui hui mai nei I tēnei ahiahi. I runga I te whakaaro hohonu e pāna ki tēnei o ngā kaupapa. Kia pupuri te Māori o tō tātou nei te riti o Waitangi. Me te wairua whakaheke a te tino kaupapa I mua I te hainatanga o te tiriti. E kia nei he whakaputanga o ngā hapu o New Tireni. I runga I tau tuāhuatanga kei te mihi atau kia koutou I whakaarohia me pēhea te huarahi tōtika, hei whai whakaaro mō ngā tuāhuatanga nā tuapapa o tō tātou nei tiriti. Ko te tino whakaaro nei, aroha tētahi ki tētahi. Manaakitanga, kaitiakitanga, oritetanga, pēhea te haere o ngā whakaaro hohonu o te ao I tēnei wā. Ka huri atau ki te mihi ki a rātou ko wehe atu ki te pō. Wira mā a Sid Jackson mā. Koutou I pupuri te Māori o tō tātou nei tipuna. I runga I te whakaaro hohonu, kei a tātou te mana whenua, te tangata whenua o tēnei whenua rangatira au Aotearoa, te tika te pono, te āhuatanga o te wā ke whai whakaaro mō ngā whakatipuranga ki te heke. Ana ko tāku nei mihi whakamutunga kia koutou, nā mana whakahi o te ao, nā mana whakahaere o tēnei huihuinga. Koutou mā o tauiwi, koutou mā I manaaki nei I tēnei kaupapa, koutou mā o nā whakaaro e pāna ki te tino rangatiratanga tēnā tātou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei wahanga. Ka huri atu au ki tērā o ngā reo, I runga I taua whakaaro hohonu, kei te mihi atu au kia koutou mā, ta tukotoru tapu pia o tēnei kaupapa I te wānei. Ko koe Rachel, ko koe Paul, ko koe Janice. Ka huri atu au ki tērā o ngā reo ke whakamārama atu te katoa, te āhuatanga o te kaupapa nei. I briefly spoke this afternoon to introduce us to the session, to remind us of the two founding documents and the values that underpin it, that inform, I think, not only the strategic direction of the relationship between governments and tangata whenua, but of organisations like unions, both private and in the public sector, that work with the values of manaakitanga, of kaitiakitanga, of respect and regard for each other, of the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of equality and equity in all we do. And I feel very privileged today to draw from our early beginnings in the union movement, certainly in the last 50 years, to pay homage to one of the most, I think, important activists, both in the establishment of the union movement, but in confronting the racism that has beset our country as a result of the colonial pedagogy which denied tangata whenua their rights. It would be wrong, I think, not to mention the great Sid Jackson, and I took a moment to reflect on all that he did in his time walking on the earth and committing to both the establishment of the Clerical Workers Union, where I was actually, one of my first jobs was as a volunteer for him, with a number, I think, of important organisers in the Māori union movement, but also in the way that he led Ngā Tamatoa and the other Māori movements for liberation, to look at ways that we can find appropriate social justice liberation practices to ensure that workers, to ensure that women, to ensure that those of us that have been oppressed by racism find pathways of well-being. I paid also homage in my opening comments. It would be wrong not to mention the fact that Wira Gardner has passed away and is presently with his peoples of Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Pikiao, and Ngāti Awa in Te Kaha. And I would like us to spare a thought for those who have gathered to farewell somebody who is a bureaucrat in the system, is certainly also someone who has worked very hard and trying for the rights of workers to find equality, to find equity, to find a voice, sometimes in spaces within government sectors where they have been silenced. I'd like to now turn to our panel and introduce them to you. It's a very, very auspicious panel, and I'm very grateful to the organisers for bringing such, I think, an important group from an experiential understanding of the union movement, but also for those efforts that they are making now to find clear strategies to address a whole range of discriminatory practices in the workplace and in the union movement itself, to develop covenants of association and arrangement, and I think importantly, to find ways that they can uphold the Te Tiriti o Waitangi arrangement at a personal and a political way within the functioning of their movements. Our first speaker today is Rachel MacIntosh. She was elected the CTU Vice President in 2015. She's an Assistant National Secretary at Te Etu, and she represents the largest private sector union. Her involvement in the union began when she was as a copy editor in the publishing industry, and she became a site delegate early in her career. She stated as an EPMU official in 2003, and as an organizer, she worked across media and manufacturing industries. She has coordinated the plastic industry strategy for several years and has assumed leadership roles from that hard ground position, doing things on the ground. As the CTU Vice President, Rachel works with a number of members of the Te Rūnanga and the National Affiliates Council to foster Te Tiriti o Waitangi relationships across the union movement. And that task is difficult given the fragmentation and I think the disparities between and amongst so many of our unions within the movement. She has worked with the largest public sector unions to negotiate gender pay principles for the broad public service, and is a key worker representative of the ILO organisation for the negotiation of a major international convention, the Violence and Harassment Convention. Can I now introduce Paul Goulter, who I'm sure needs no introduction for many of us who've been part of the union movement for several years. Until recently, he was the National Secretary of NZEI, Te Rūroa in New Zealand. He started working in unions as a field officer for the New Zealand Bank Officers Union and eventually became General Secretary of FinSec, the New Zealand Financial Sector Union. Paul then worked as Secretary of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, followed by time in Australia, Sydney, working for the Australian Council of Trade Union as Director of the Organising Centre. He moved back to New Zealand some 7 years ago and has recently taken up a job with NZEO. He is somebody that has worked at the cutting edge of policy developments to confront racism, and I'm very much looking forward to what he says today. And I want to pay tribute to our final speaker, Janice. She is someone like myself who's devoted her whole life to the movements for the liberation of Māori people. She started her work in the PSA in 1984. She was previously on the executive board of the Clerical Workers Union. She ran for Parliament as a mana motuhake and alliance candidate. In the 1980s, Māori unions came together under the leadership of distinguished men and women that have left our folds, unfortunately, like Eddie McLeod, like Sid Jackson, like Hannah Jackson. And she demanded with them a genuine treaty partnership and greater representation with union structures. To do this, she worked within the sectors that she was working with and employed by, and vigilantly outside that organisation to try and establish a national Māori organisation as an umbrella group to draw kaupapa Māori initiatives for union strategies. In her role with Te Rūnanga o ngā tō āwhina, with the move to organise by sectors, she was able to organise some 8,000 PSA members as part of her role. She will bring, I think, an important lens to the debates that we are going to have this afternoon. She will talk about the troubled history of Māori with the state, but also the conflicts that unions and state employees with the PSA have had to confront, and her own personal experiences of racism, where she's been an on-the-ground advocate for many. People might not know, but she was also present during the Land March and she was a part of those that occupied Bastion Point. She is somebody that truly walks her talk. When she got her present position, this phrase, which I want to use to end my introduction, was gifted to her by one of her main whānau support. I think it's an important phrase for us to reflect on in our kōrero today. Tuia te tiriti ki runga, tuia te tiriti ki raro, tuia te tiriti ki roto, tuia te tiriti ki waho, te hei Māori ora. Let us weave the tapestry of the te tiriti understandings and guarantees above us. Let us weave the same tapestry below us. Ensure that that tapestry of understanding provides an understanding within and uses it as a basis from which we can challenge without. Today, I introduce at this stage Rachel MacIntosh to start our discussions. I thank all of you for coming this afternoon to listen, to look at how we may find ways forward to confront the racism that unfortunately still besets too many of us in the ways we work and in our workplaces. And I look forward to your questions being delivered so that we can answer them at the end of our session. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Annette. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Kia ora, Annette, mō tō mihi. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow panellists, Paul and Janice. You've just heard about them, and thank you for that introduction, Annette. I'd also like to mention Sid Jackson. I'm aware of, he was before my time, but there are others, and we do stand on the shoulders of giants in the union movement. And I would like to just particularly mention Helen Kelly, who was a brave and fearless fighter, taken too soon. When I started working in the union movement was 19 years ago, and I had recently been involved in tiriti education with Tamaki treaty workers, and I started my job as a union official, and I thought, oh, this is going to be good. I'm really going to be able to apply this education here in my role. And at that stage, nearly 20 years ago, it wasn't obvious how I could do that. And so it felt a little bit like I had some tools, but I really didn't know where to use them. And I suspect that that experience is still quite common for a lot of people. But what I did at that time was every time I would speak to Māori members about our runanga, and every time there was a course for Māori members, I would submit names. And I didn't really know what else I could do. And the reason I start with that story is because I think there can be a huge difference between what happens at an institutional level and the experience day to day for working people. And I am here representing the Council of Trade Unions, and I just want to make the point that everything we do as a peak body needs to have consequences and positive consequences for working people. And in Te Tiriti, it needs to have positive consequences for kaimahi Māori. I do want to speak briefly about the evolving relationship in my time between Te Ruranga of the CTU and the National Affiliates Council, the CTU itself. And about that time when I was starting as a union official, there was an agreement document that was signed between Te Ruranga and the National Affiliates Council. And it was an important document, and it was a point in time that marked the increase of the respect and the understanding between tauiwi and kaimahi Māori in the movement. If you look at that document, it very much has the National Affiliates Council as the centre and the Runanga as a secondary side organisation. And 10 years later, there was a document that I was involved in the evolution of, and that was, it's called Te Taka Waenga. It's a one-page document, and it is no longer the NAC at the centre and the Runanga at the side, but it's a very, it's a relationship document that says this is what Te Runanga will do, this is what the National Affiliates Council will do, and this is what we will do together. And so I just think that that does show that there has been an evolution and understanding. And as a result of that document, we have quarterly conversations, a small group of us from the National Affiliates Council and Te Ringa discuss the plans of each side of the movement, what we're doing, what we can do together, and how we can support each other. And we have an annual meeting of Te Ringa with union leaders where we discuss te tiriti, and we discuss the experiences of unions, what progress we're making, what ideas we can share, and what progress we might be able to make. I want to particularly just mention the role of tauiwi. I think our role as tauiwi is to support and make space for the voices and strength of Māori workers. And also there's a constant turnover in the union movement, which means there are always people right at the beginning of their journey with te tiriti and their understanding. And as tauiwi, we have a responsibility to be educating new tauiwi to the movement. There's a question, because I think ideas are important as well as what's happened on the ground, is there's been a discussion about kotahitanga and solidarity. Solidarity is the historical value of the union movement, and are they the same? They're similar, and I think it's important to acknowledge that they're actually not the same, that kotahitanga is different, that it involves whenua and whakapapa in a way that solidarity doesn't. So that tauiwi in this conversation can be listening and not assuming that you can just translate a word from one reo into the other and that it's going to mean the same thing. I want to talk about tripartism. So tripartism is an international kind of standard for industrial relations where you have government, employers and workers discussing together in three-way negotiations. And in New Zealand, it's really important, the role of iwi in that conversation. And for unions, it's really important that Māori workers have a voice in that conversation as well, because often if you bring iwi into the conversation, they are employers. And so it's really vital that we do have representation of Māori workers. There is a recent example of that. There's a governing advisory body for WorkSafe, which is tripartite, and it has Māori employers, it has government representatives, and then from the union movement, it has tauiwi workers and Māori workers as part of that. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that representation is necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition to actually make a difference. So I will talk a little bit about some of the practical things, experiences that we have recently and now in the movement for supporting Māori. There was one really significant thing, and Helen Kelly, who I mentioned at the beginning, was central to this, is that in the tallies dispute, where meat workers had been locked out for months and months, the iwi leaders came on board because it was their whānau who were locked out, who were suffering in that tallies dispute, and they were key to solving it. And Te Ringa of the CTU was instrumental in that relationship as well. We now have a requirement for unions to report on iwi affiliation of our membership, so that we know where Māori workers are in the movement. That's evolving because not all unions are equipped to do that, but there is an evolution there. We have recently negotiated with Te Wānanga o Aotearoa to have te reo courses available in work time for Māori members, and we are prioritising Māori workers in that. There are several unions involved in a Waitangi tribunal claim, which is the mana wāhine claim, and I know Janice is going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm skipping over some things because I think time is a moving. I just want to talk briefly about the difference between the public and the private sector in dealing with te tiriti. So it's much, much harder to make headway in the private sector. Transnational corporations control a lot of the employment in this country in the private sector. And those employers have absolutely no point of reference for a conversation. In the public sector, employers, at least, they have a point of reference. There is legislation supporting it. The Education Act of 2020 requires honouring Te Tiriti, so it's moved away from the principle. So there are tools available to the public sector that are not available to the private sector. And so that doesn't mean we do nothing in the private sector, it just indicates the uphill battle when you have international capital controlling employment relationships. So I will just talk about a few of the things. Fair pay agreements, which is a pan-union campaign, but very strongly being led in private sector unions, E2 and First Union. Living wage campaigns and pay equity campaigns, because initiatives that exacerbate inequality always disproportionately affect women, Māori, Pacifica. Initiatives that reduce inequality will have material effects and positive effects on Māori workers' lives. And all those campaigns are supported by rūnanga across the movement. I want to briefly mention Ngā Puna Whaioranga, which is a project in my own union funded by ACC, so we had to get public money to fund this, working with Māori and Pacific workers in the manufacturing industry on health and safety, strengthening the representation role, and really operating from a Māori-centred view for those workers. And just finally, I want to mention that what we do institutionally is important, the ideas that we have are important, but actually unions can just get out and do things, and I want to honour First Union for the role that they played supporting the protectors at Ihumātao. So the whole movement was in support of that occupation, but First Union, really, they just got out there, they did it. They didn't stop and ask questions and hand wring, they did it, and so full honour to them. And yeah, that was a pretty hasty race through some of the issues, and happy to take questions in a little bit. But for now, I will hand over to Paul Goulter. Kia ora tātou.
Paul, I think you need to unmute yourself. It's Annette speaking.
Sorry about that, too many Zooms, too much silence. Kia ora koutou, ka nui te mihi, kia koutou katoa, tēnā koe Annette, ko Paul Goulter tōku ingoa. My name's Paul Goulter. I am currently the Chief Executive of NZNO tōpōtanga tāpui kia kaitiaki o te Aotearoa, which is the nurses' organisation, but prior to that, as Annette said, I had many years as the National Secretary of NZEI. I've only just joined NZNO, so I can't pretend to speak for them in this space. In fact, Annette would probably know more than I would about that. So I asked permission of Loris Park, NZEI Te Reo-Roa's Mātua Takawainga, if I could speak on behalf of NZEI, which she said I could, so I'm pretty sure you're there, Loris. I also just want to recognise Sid. I first came across and worked with Sid in the 1980s, which sort of dates some people, and I found him a tremendous leader, and his influence lives on strongly, certainly in my experience. I also just want to acknowledge Steph Mills, my successor at NZEI Te Reo. I see she's on, and Steph will do a fantastic job in continuing the changes that NZEI Te Reo has made in this space. I just want to say that with unions, I think there are triple obligations that fall if we're going to properly observe our obligations under the Te Tiriti. I think, first of all, we have to change our own unions. Before we go preaching to anyone else, we certainly need to make sure inside our own unions that we are truly observing the requirements of what we need to do under Te Reti. And that means identifying racism where it lies and dealing with it. I think secondly, we need to work to eliminate racism in the enterprises that we organise and in the sectors and the industries that we work in. And that can take different forms and it works in different ways, but it's an obligation that falls on unions. And thirdly, we have to take part in what we need to do as a nation if we're going to truly grow and reflect and respect the obligations that fall out of Te Reti. And I think those three obligations need to work together, because if one gets out of kilter with the others, I think change will be dragged back. Inside NZI Te Reo, we've grappled with this issue for many, many years. And it wasn't until in the last couple of years that Loris Park, and I credit her for this, came up with the notion of moku te ao. And for me, that immediately gave something which I felt we'd been lacking. It's a dynamic construct. It actually says you do things. And I think I'm sick and tired of organisations, and often unions do this, where we describe ourselves as effective treaty partners or whatever, and we talk about all the talk, but we don't do anything. And then just moving the pieces around actually doesn't add up to much either. It's about what's that living force that has to occur within a union if we're really going to make the changes that matter. And when that notion of moku te ao came through, for me anyway, and for NZI Te Reo, it was actually the way that we could go about and more effectively do our business, as long as we treated it as a dynamic construct, an actual doing thing, not just a talking about it. And so we decided we needed to get our own house in order, and we needed to be outward facing. And I just want to read from a document that is the preamble to our moku te ao work. It says, NZI Te Reo are leading changes for the education of Māori by showing political strength and industrial leadership to claim the space to flip the education system. The whawhai to change the education system for every mokopuna Māori is real. The time is now, and the karanga must be heard. Maranga mai. And that really captures what we're trying to do. We've identified 4 areas we need to focus on. First of all, changing the union internally, and we're very grateful for one of the great leaders in Māori education, Kerry Milne Ihaimara, who a number of you may know for her brave stand as a principal, particularly in Moariwa, has been helping NZI on that. Secondly, we decided we needed to build and deepen external relationships with groups like the Teaching Council, the Ministry of Education, iwi, etc., and talk through and try and drive change based on the concept of moku te ao. Thirdly, we took on and continue to take on specific projects, outward-facing projects that, how do we do our bargaining in a moku te ao environment? What are the organising projects we need to focus on? How do we handle or deal with kahongareo? How do we deal with streaming, that incredibly racist practice that exists across schooling? And since then, we've started working with Te Kono Taraki at Ngaitahu. And then in the pay equity space, the government say that they want to raise the wages of the low paid Māori and women. Well, we have to take that challenge up. And I'm very pleased to say that very soon it will be announced that NZI will have secured the first pay equity deal for a solely Māori population, in this case, kairahi i te reo, who work in schools supporting teachers and others as they develop te reo. And that we find that is very, very exciting. And then lastly, we have to move our membership. It's no sense just moving the head office without moving the membership. And what does that look like? Very quickly, 3 things I've noticed in this journey. First of all, when you do these changes, there's a big search for a tick the box outcome. People say, oh, tell us what it means so we can tick boxes to say we've done it. And our approach has been, no, we're not going to give you a template. We're going to talk you through what it means, and then you apply it to your own work. You approach your own work through the lens of that construct, and then we'll work together on that. If it's ticked the box, it's dead. Secondly, change accelerates. If we can get the start of it right, it accelerates very quickly. And within a couple of years, NZI Te Reo was brave enough to take on changing its whole calendar year to a maramataka year. And that change is underway right now. And that's producing all sorts of interesting conversations, as indeed it must, across the organisation. It isn't a change from the Gregorian calendar to another calendar. It's a fundamental change the way NZI Te Reo thinks through its work. Thirdly, change is difficult in this area. Many unions have looked to changing roles, creating, for example, a co-president as evidence of their commitment to Te Riti. And that's for them. For our journey was slightly different. We needed to start doing things, and out of that, we would grow the maturity to take on the structures that NZI Te Reo has. I'm a big fan of the Frank Lloyd Wright statement, form follows function. If we start to actually do something, the rest of it will fall into place. And lastly, how do we apply it in the workplace? Well, Kaikōrero is an excellent example of this. And I want to acknowledge the founders of that movement, an incredible piece of work that is enduring. It is enduring, but in our view, it's under some danger. And particularly when we look at the terms and conditions of the kaimahi who work within the Kaikōrero. And NZI has for many years attempted to organise those workers to deal with what are some pretty ordinary terms and conditions of employment. We've been opposed for that. We've been told we're a Pākehā institution, that Kaikōrero is not early childhood education, which I totally agree with. And then we come up against the very foundational concept of te tino rangatiratanga. How does that apply in circumstances where a workforce is enduring suboptimal terms and conditions of employment, if for no other reason the funding mechanisms are crook? So we have to take that on and take that on in a way that works with the trust in order to ensure that the core foundation of the trust, which is the protection and promotion of te reo, is absolutely observed. And for many years we struggled with that, and I'm very pleased to say that in the last 6 months or so, the Trust and NZI Te Reo have started to find common ground, ironically around the notion of pay equity. And together, I think, and I'm ever hopeful, that that will craft out a journey whereby the urgent needs of Kaikōrero can be met and the urgent needs of the terms and conditions of the kaimahi who work there can also be met. I'm ever hopeful about that. That's taken years to get to. This stuff just doesn't happen overnight, as we all know. And wherever there are levers to advance our Te Riti conversations, we will take them. So, Janice, over to you.
Oh, kia ora pō. Ko whakatiri rawa ko pūhanga tōhora nā maunga, ko wairua rawa ko punaki tere nā awa, ko kaipara rawa ko hokianga whakapau, karakia nā moana, ko nā toki mata whaurua taku waka, ko maungarongo rawa ko kōrahi nā marae, ko parawhau, ko uriroroi rawa, ko nai te wake, ko Ngāti One, nā hapu, ko Ngāti Whātua rawa, ko Ngāpui Nui tonu nā iwi, ko Cyril Panoho rawa, ko Mate Dalton, oku matua, ko Janice Panoho taku ingoa, ti hei Māori ora. Nā mihi kia koutou, inga mana whenua, tēnā koutou, inga iwi, tēnā koutou, inga rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koe Annette hoki, tēnā kōrua Paul and Rachel. I'd just like to start off with acknowledging the number of wāhine Māori leaders who are sharing their experiences today and through the week, I hope, at this auspicious hui. And they're our grandmothers, our mothers, our aunties, our sisters, our nieces, our mokopuna and colleagues, all, and will also have their own individual stories and similar themes, but however they're similar to what most of us experience around racism, and have experienced and continue to experience. So I see the union as a voice for workers in their own voice for workers that play a critical role in the labour market and our economy, government and employers. Our focus needs to be lifting the capability and cultural competencies within organisations to bring about progressive and much needed change. These changes can happen through collective bargaining by identifying the issues that most affect Māori and Pacifica and ethnic groups, which can influence decisions through policy guidance and procedures. A lot of the work that I do, I work for the PSA as the Kaihotu Māori, but we look at in terms of through the lens to say what are the issues that affect our members, and what I've found is that Māori tend to be left as an afterthought, and we are now bringing it to the forefront through our Ngā Kaupapa Māori clauses around the principles that need to be embedded into collective agreements. But also, we also need to look at that some of these groups, in terms of the influences around policy guidance and procedures, it's essential that our discussions with employers and members include te tiriti as a fundamental foundation for our existence, and the importance of embedding this into practice when considering how changes will be implemented to eliminate the systemic issues of bias, discrimination and racism at the workplace and in our society. We should no longer accept or tolerate subtle or overt bias, discrimination and racism at the workplace and in society today. These behaviours are unacceptable and has been allowed to permeate and fester without challenge or consequence. So, in terms of unions, government and employers have an important role to work constructively to change the landscape, to become more inclusive of society by introducing cultural affirmation for Māori as tangata whenua and our brothers and sisters from the Pacific and new immigrants towards a more diverse workplace. There are a number of projects that we are involved in at the moment, and one of them is actually quite important. But before I do that, I just want to talk about some of the, in the public service, we've only got 39 public service leaders, which include 34 secretaries and chief executives. And out of that, we've got about 3 acting secretaries and chief executives and 2 deputy public service commissioners. There are 20 women, which is 51%, and 19 men, which is about 49%. We've got less than probably 5%, or not even that, I think, that are Māori. There might be 2 or 3 Māori that are representative of this group. You can imagine they're the decision brokers, they're making the decisions, and this is on government policy. So we need to lift our capability, but we need to also be led in the door. That's one of our biggest problems. Another big piece of work that I'm working on is called Kia Toipoto. It's closing the gender ethnic pay gap, and we did the launch last year in November, and we've provided and we've just developed the guidance to that's being rolled out in the next month to public service and Crown entities, and this is looking at their processes, policies, how they actually starting salaries in terms of where they're actually starting people to start reducing the gender pay gap. So back in, I think, 2018, it was about 12%. It has now come down to I think it's 8.6%, which is huge, but we thought by now we would have closed the gender pay gap. But I can be totally honest with you, unless we address the bias, discrimination and racism, we're never going to close the gap for women and for Māori women and for Pacifica women and for ethnic minorities. So we need to address that, and this is what I'm working on. This is one of my big projects, and I'm working as the co-chairperson with the Koa Mataho, with a number of agencies that are a part of Te Whakapiri, as well as our union delegates who are involved. The other piece of work that we're doing is the mana wāhine claim. So this, we've got three reports, and in 2020, we surveyed in terms of Māori public servants, 919 of our members actually provided in terms of real data about, provided us with feedback. And some of the data shows 68% of wāhine Māori surveyed were subject to racism discrimination at the workplace. And the number probably is higher than what was recorded. Of those who were such disadvantage occurred in hiring, promotion, their work, including cultural work as wāhine Māori and many aspects of working life. Some of this was documented on how it affected their mental health and well-being. At least 144 comments such were discrimination were provided. There were only about a quarter of those participants that said they weren't, that they'd never experienced unfair treatment at the workplace, which in my lifetime, I can't ever say that that's the case for the women that I know and have experienced this. I'll also talk about in terms of 27% of the participants that agreed that their equitable recruitment for wāhine Māori in the workplace, the reasons given for believing recruitment is not equitable includes a lack of Māori personnel in organisation, a lack of wāhine Māori in senior positions, HR, and that they do not value te reo o tikanga skills and policy and practice. I could actually provide more data, but it's those types of experiences from the wāhine Māori that we've registered. We're still waiting to hear on when, in terms of the tribunal has received a copy of our report, but it's more about in terms of now waiting to hear back. And I know that Annette was also part of the claim. There were other organisations like the nurses, education, the education unions who put in a claim, and so PSA is just one of many. I haven't got anything other than I've worked for the PSA probably for 38 years now, and I just wanted to say during that time I've worked with some great people, as Annette has mentioned, in terms of Sid Jackson, when I was on the Clerical Workers Union executive. But recently I was also the chairperson for Te Aramahi Māori. We just finished launching the Māori Employment Action Plan, and the Minister, Willie Jackson, as well as Minister Sepuloni, thanked us because we identified so many failings in the system around education of our rangatahi, the ability for them to come out with qualifications and land good employment is a real issue for our people. So we've got a number of recommendations. So if you ever want to have a look at that plan, that's on Minister Sepuloni's website. Kia ora, Annette.
Kia ora.
That's all I have to say.
all three of you have raised a lot of issues. There's a couple of questions that have come through that are generic ones. And perhaps if I start with one of the first ones from Maringi Marsh, how are the practices of racism identified within your unions? I think that's an important question. And then another one I think that's allied to that is we're encouraging the acquisition of te reo me ona tikanga. Is this award being put forward as part of collective bargaining? I think if you could answer those two questions together, and if we start with you, Rachel, on those ones, and then there's three other questions that are big. So if we can get through this first two in the next 5 minutes, we'll leave those other questions for the last 10.
Oh, kia ora, Annette. Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a big question, and I'll be frank. That's not a question that I hear very often. How do we identify racism? Like, we know that it's all around. I can talk about some of the things that within my union we're trying to do about it. So I mentioned the Ngāpuna Whaioranga project, which is aiming to lift Māori up. Within our staff, we took advice from our Māori staff, and they suggested that as a first step we offer a tikanga course. So that's just happening this year, and the aim is that that gets rolled out and as a foundation to increase cultural competence, so that we can begin to have those conversations and address the issues. The other, I've just lost my train.
The te reo Māori me ona tikanga, is it part of collective bargaining?
Oh yeah, so it's
the Education and Training Act now.
No, it's part of. It is a legal entitlement to employment relations education leave. So actually, we don't have to negotiate for that release. We've already got that legal right, and it's being done under that. You know, we could collectively bargain for greater than that, but that's a kind of foundation to start with rights that we've already got.
Kia ora. Paul?
Kia ora, Annette. The first question, how are the practices of racism identified in your union? We decided within NZEI Te Reo Rā to do a survey of all of our union staff, and Kerry Milne Haimara I mentioned before, she conducted that. She's a very skilled researcher. There was a separate section for our Māori staff as well. They were interviewed personally, so we didn't just take and wash it all out just by a whole of union. There was a particular space for that, and that did identify practices that weren't appropriate or right. And work streams have been developed to address that, work streams which have accountabilities built into them. So we didn't muck around for NZEI on that. We just had to do it straight away. In terms of the membership, it's more difficult, as you'll appreciate, and there are so you tend to be more anecdotally driven. Things like the Teaching Council, one of its teaching standards is understanding and appreciating fully. I've forgotten the words around the treaty, and it never fails any teachers on that. It never fails them. So either we've got a great teaching workforce, or these standards aren't being properly applied. So these are anecdotal issues. Initial teacher education, very, very often remarked, particularly by Māori principals, te akatia, that it's not delivering what is needed in the classroom, be it in kura or in main general stream schools, what's needed. So it's a mixture of research, but also anecdotal stuff. It all joins up to say our education system is not working for tamariki Māori, and it's racist.
Janice, have you got anything to add on the other question too about collective bargaining for te reo me ona tikanga and how we can make that more effective, as well as identifying practices of racism in unions, and what are the processes for that?
Yeah, well, with the first question, we actually did a treaty audit, and Moana Jackson conducted that treaty audit within the PSA, and the Runanga had commissioned him to do that. So that was years ago, and it identified a number of failings, and which we rectified by appointing a tapopo, which was Lawrence back then. And then when Lawrence left, there was nothing. And it's only recently, through my appointment, I'm the Kaihotu Māori part of the leadership team, that they have started to recognise they needed to implement having Māori leadership within our union structure. The other thing that I have implemented, that I have Māori EA, I've also got Te Runanga organiser that looks after the Runanga, and we've got an NSL, which is sort of like a middle management, Marcia Puru, who's our national lead, and we've just recently appointed Mike Tana to do some mahi for us as a Māori. So you've got to get your structure in place. You've got to have, in terms of a framework that's going to be able to have a team of Māori leadership within the union construct. The other thing is in collective bargaining, we've got kaupapa Māori claims, which we've put into a document. Those are expected to be negotiated by organisers at the workplace. So for the te reo e me tikanga clauses, we've got that, and there's an expectation that, you know, those clauses are negotiated as part of, in terms of normal bargaining claims. Yeah. Kia ora. Oh, you're on silent.
So 2 questions, Rachel. One is for you directly from Catherine Delahanty. I was wondering if you can comment on the CTU health and safety work for Māori workers poisoned at work swap. I'm very familiar with those from Whakapatane, and is CTU willing to help swap fight ACC as these workers led from Whakapatane are mainly Māori? So that's a question for you. And then can I direct the next question from Tanya Taima Campbell to you, Paul, if you can look at it in your question and answer. It's about the changes in the health sector, the institutionalized racism when it's raised with DHB staff. They quite often take it personally, and there is no transformation. It gets caught there. So if I could just leave those for you two, and then maybe the last question for you, Janice. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So Rachel, you on the first question, please.
Oh, kia ora, Annette. Kia ora, Catherine. Look, I am sorry I don't have a direct answer for you on that, but I'm really happy to talk to you about it and see if we can strategise and see how we can marshal some resources for that fight, because I'm also aware of it, because I know Catherine. So kia ora. Sorry, Catherine, that's the best I can do at the minute.
And Paul, have you managed to digest Timer's question? Is a big question with a lot in it. So, but can I say, while it's directed at the health sector, I think it's a real concern that there is transformative change coming through both structures like the Māori Health Authority being instituted, and through the Education and Training Act with significant treaty clauses, but no significant change. And how can the unions take more leadership to provide that, or to act as change agents, is what she's asking.
Thanks for that. In terms of the health sector, I don't know how anyone can say that the health sector is working for Māori. It's absolutely broken. It's failing continually. The changes that have been brought in by Labour with Māori Health Authority, and as I said before, I'm nowhere near up to speed on this. It seems to me to be a very good basis to start to move out. And I listened to Mason Jury yesterday talking about this point, and he was very positive about the opportunities that are provided. His view, you would see the same thing occurring in education, social welfare, children, housing, that sort of thing, and that basically these authorities take over and eventually will collectivise under a non-government leadership. I think that's the only way forward, because you can have as much stuff as you want in these acts, and I do note the change in the Education and Training Act to be way past the principles, which didn't appear to me to work particularly well. But the point is, who's going to make people do it? Do people understand what needs to be done, and how will you know it's been done? And that's in the education area. That's completely at large. With it, I would hope in the Māori Health Authority that those questions are answered far more explicitly.
Thank you. And Janice, there's two questions actually that I think are on the theme of what you've been talking about. One is from Lisa Fox, who highlights the pay gaps for Pākehā women, Māori men, Māori women, Pacifica men, Pacifica women. She highlights that the Pacific pay gap has not reduced in 10 years. What is the union movement's role, or how are we going to change or close the pay gaps? But I think there's another question that sits in this, which is Kate Bartlett's question, that we've got a range of leadership initiatives, and a lot of Pākehā and non-Māori have held those roles of leadership for a long time. But in this new environment of trying to find equitable representation, or the best person to represent Te Reo Meona Tiganga, for example, there's a reticence to give up that leadership to Māori coming through. How do we deal with that, Janice? You know, these are hard issues. These are cutting edge.
Yeah, but it's a really good question. I suppose we've had to challenge it through our Māori structures within our own organisation, saying it is not good enough that the union movement has not appointed a Māori leader, and this is my point, was only a year ago. So through advocating through the Te Runanga, our Māori delegates, and also through Māori staff who've really challenged the organisation to get their act together. And, you know, it comes at a price, but most of us have said this is well overdue, and we need to be able to have people that are responsive to our call. How are we going to address these issues if we're not sitting at the table? And it's like the CEs. How many Māori are sitting at the table in the public service? Well, I've let you know that there's only 2 that you've got as CEs in the public service. And that's not good enough, because they're making the decisions.
A question that Grant Brooks raised, Paul, you might want to do this one. It's a key issue, is how does each party into treaty relationships with unions deal with diversity? You know, Māori aren't homogenous. Iwi leaders and elites are quite different than workers sometimes, to use that kind of class analogy. There were iwi leaders, to use Rachel's example, that were right there with Tainui and at Wairoa for the freezing workers. There were others that just watched, you know. In Rotorua here, though, there was workers who coalesced together to drop kai off for the workers over at Rangiuru. So, you know, this is a key issue. How do we deal with the diversity of Māori within the union movement?
It's a really good question, because it goes to a Pākehā worldview that basically all Māori are the same. And in fact, until we as Pākehā understand that is absolutely not the case, and the full diversity right across the motu within iwi, hapu and the like, we're never going to get it, which is one of the reasons why in NTDI Te Reo Roa we did set out to try and strike relationships with individual iwi or other groups to try and break through that pan Māori view that many Pākehā hold, and it's one of the things that holds us back, because we say, oh, you know, oh, they don't understand. But the point is, we're applying a cookie cutter approach to the whole thing, and it doesn't work.
Okay, I'm going to cut us off here. We got a minute to go. Can I say one of the themes emerging here, which we haven't really confronted, is Pākehā to give up power. It's a real issue. It's a real issue, and I don't know how we're going to do it. I struggle in the judicial context of appointment of Māori judges to that forum. I'd struggle in the workplace. How do we give up power without feeling like we're giving up dignity as human beings? Because quite often in our pursuit for equity and giving something up, we're actually taking on the need for equality to be seen to be being affected. So I know we're at the end of it. Can I thank the questions? What I may suggest as a way forward is there's some specific to each of your areas that you might want to follow up, as Rachel's doing, but maybe a 10-second sum up from all of us, and thank you for all of you leaving it to the last 5 minutes to put up 20 questions. It makes it all very hard for us. Kia ora. Rachel, can you 10 seconds just to sign us in?
Totally, tatiriti and racism is about power, and Pākehā have got to get really uncomfortable and give up power as part of this journey. And another thing I'd say is that we haven't really addressed is the lack of resources into our Māori, which makes, you know, if our tauiwi says, oh, we want to have a relationship, but actually people are really stretched, and that's another huge issue, along with the lack of homogeneity. Thanks everybody for coming. Kia kaha.
Paul, have you got any final comments? Paul, and then Janice.
I mean, it's been a great session. I think the power question goes to the guts of it, and it's not given up easily. I mean, that's the historical truth. But the point is, once from the Pākehā side they understand the real answer to your question, you actually see you can move things forward way more quickly and with dignity and respect to all parties.
Janice, kei a koe te kōrero whakamutanga mo te rā. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I'd just like to say that I'm inspired by our rangatahi because they are our future, and because more of them now have the knowledge, the reo, the tikanga, I'm hoping that they will be able to carry on the fight. For most of us that have been around for a long time, that's what I'm looking forward to, and I will work hard with my own mokopuna to make sure that happens. Kia ora koutou.
It's time to sign out, everybody. Don't go home into your armchairs. Reflect on all the hard questions asked here and start organising for change. Kia ora.